Today we're back out on location in Kent and I want to show you the power of shooting in panoramic and how it will allow you to capture the world from a very different perspective. We're going to explore creating panoramics using the new Mavic 4 Pro, and take advantage of its 28, 70 and 168mm lens, and we're going to do all of this in this beautiful location. Panoramas allow you to be able to capture vast landscapes with dramatic skies and add storytelling elements to your images that you can't always achieve using just a single frame. Over the past year, I've been using panoramas to capture everything from mountain ranges in Indonesia to desert plains in Namibia, and the results are always stunning. So let's look at when and why you might want to go about taking a panoramic using your drone. Firstly, it's going to be when the image is simply too large to fit into a single frame. Alternatively, if you want to create something that's more immersive for your viewers, you might want to look to use it too. Thirdly, it's going to be when you need that higher megapixel if you're looking to print large. And finally, if you've got flight restrictions where you can't move far enough away from the subject to fit it all in, by using a panoramic, you can capture much more of the scene. Okay, so because I'm going to be flying with a much larger drone today, it's important that I maintain a safe distance from the actual church. So I'm going to find a safe spot to go and fly. Coming out on mornings like this remind me just how beautiful the British countryside is. I just wanted to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing if you're not doing so already. If you like this kind of content, I've got lots more coming to the channel over the coming weeks and months. So the first thing to say about this drone is it's big and it's heavy, and in order to comply with UK regulations at the moment, I need to make sure that I'm a safe distance away from people and buildings. So I've come about 300 or 400 metres away from the church. I've got a very nice clean line of sight, and it should be a perfect place to be able to try out these panoramics. Let's get it up in the air and see what we can find.
Take off. Home point updated.
Let's start by switching the drone into panoramic mode. There are a total of 5 styles available. The first 4 are predefined fields of view. You can experiment with these, but I generally find they capture far more of the scene than I really want. That's why today we're going to focus on the freestyle. Let me start by adjusting our exposure compensation, as we want to keep all of the details in the highlights, and we can always recover from the shadows a little bit more easily. Next, we need to configure what we're going to capture and in what format we're going to store it. Output refers to the final panoramic image that the drone will create on our behalf. Even though I never use these files, they are very useful for previewing how your composition looks, allowing you to make adjustments and shoot again before getting home to find out it wasn't quite right. So personally, I keep this turned on. Next, we need to configure how we're going to store our original files, and these are the individual photographs that are going to be taken to make up our panoramic. By default, they're set to JPEG, even if your main camera for photos is set to RAW. This caught me out the first time I used this feature, so be aware of it. If you intend to do any post-processing, I strongly recommend that you capture these in RAW. Okay, let's begin, and we can see that the drone is asking us to set our start point. I'm going to position the drone in the top left-hand corner of my composition and press C1 to lock that in. Next, I'm going to reposition the drone to the bottom right-hand corner of my composition and again press C1 to set my endpoint. This is the clever part. The drone is now going to calculate 3 really useful pieces of information. The first is it's going to require a total of 4 photographs to make this panoramic. Secondly, it's going to take 14 seconds to take these 4 images and stitch them for us. And finally, it creates this very useful augmented reality green box that shows us what's going to be in our final composition when we press go. This is extremely useful because it allows us to be able to cancel and start again if something is cropped out or missing from the composition that we think is actually important. In this example, I'm happy with what we've got, so I'm going to go ahead and press start. Once the images have been captured, we need to wait whilst it processes them to create the final panoramic. It's useful to go into the library and preview the output file. I often use this as a guide to tweak my composition. Now let's reposition the drone further away from the church in order to accommodate the 70mm lens. We can see how when switching the lens, it really starts to compress the scene and how much larger the clouds become in our frame. Let's frame up another composition. We can see that the technique is identical, but once complete, I notice 2 differences. Firstly, to accommodate this framing, it will require 9 photos. And when we look at our augmented border, we can see that it's a lot less distorted because we're using that longer lens. When we preview this back, I find this is a much more pleasing panoramic composition, as we are suffering from a lot less distortion caused by the wide-angle lens. If we repeat this process of moving further back again, and this time switching over to the 168mm lens when we frame up the panoramic, we can see that this time it requires 16 images and the augmented framing has zero distortion showing. I like this composition and the beautiful light interacting with the fields around it. Unfortunately, during the taking of the 16 images, we can see that at the time when it photographed the church, there was no sun falling on it. Without generating the preview image, we might have missed this. Okay, let's have another go at taking this composition. This is where one of the limitations of the panoramic mode becomes apparent. The fact that it is not remembered between shots and the framing that we set up, and there's no way of being able to store this or recall it in order to rerun it again. I got it close enough, but it would have been nice if they were both identical so that I could have done a bit of time blending with some of the shadows from the first attempt. Next, let's keep the drone away from the church and this time switch to using the wide-angle lens to capture a large amount of the field and skies. By not getting too close to our subject, the distortion is minimised and actually we can use it to great effect, as in the case with these patterns in the field. They act as a great lead-in line, taking our eyes down towards the church. Finally, using the 70mm lens, which doesn't have quite so much distortion, let's have a go at doing a portrait image. I'm going to start by pointing it at the top of the clouds and then taking it all the way down and pointing it at the fields. We can check out the bounding box, and if we're happy, go ahead and take the images. We can see it created a nice portrait image, which is an incredibly useful technique, especially if your camera does not rotate into the portrait orientation. So that wraps up our field work. Let's pack up and head back to the office, and I'll show you how I stitch these together using the very affordable PanoVolo.
So the first thing I like to do when I get back to the office is to be able to create a fresh catalogue to be able to put my files into. I've gone ahead and imported them all and created a folder called DJI Rendered. This contains the JPEGs that it stitched together for us during flight. And these are really handy because we can go in and inspect them. So I can take a look at the file, I can put it full screen, I can zoom in, and I can see it's created a really nice JPEG rendering. But what I can also do is take a look at this file name, and I can see that at the end it's appended this number 0036, and this very usefully corresponds to a folder that it's created for me into which it's put the raw files. So we can then go in and we can see the 9 individual raw files that it's created, and these are the ones that we're going to be able to go ahead and work with. So once I've identified an image that I want to work on, I go ahead and I'll select all of the raw files, and I will export those as TIFFs for working on in PanoVolo. Now I've created a preset called PanoVolo, and this just exports them all as full-size TIFF files. So once that's done, I'm going to switch into PanoVolo and I'm going to select that directory containing the 9 images. And we'll see that it's going through processing, rendering, and we get our preview immediately on screen. And we can see it's stitched them together beautifully. Now, PanoVolo does have many different options that you can play around with, and I find that the real benefit for using this is the different models by which we can stitch together. Personally, I find that rectilinear works the best in most cases, but there are times when some of these others will give a more pleasing stitching. So let's take a look what happens when we put cylindrical. And we can see it renders it in a slightly different way, and we can go through and we can look at all the different models. And when you find one that you're happy with, you can stick with that. I'll stick with the rectilinear because I believe it's giving me the most amount of information here. Once we're happy, we can go up and we can export this. So we go up and we do Save Panorama. I've gone ahead and created a folder called Stitched inside my photography. This is just a convenient place in which to be able to store my panoramics. Now at this point, it's probably quite important that you remember to change from JPEG to TIFF so that we're retaining as much of the detail as possible, because the whole point of this is that we want to be able to edit the files ourselves. So I'll go ahead and save that as Pano1. So once that's exported, we can now switch back into Lightroom to be able to work on that. Let's go ahead and synchronize our stitched folder. And there we have our newly created file. Now the real benefit of doing it this way is that we've ended up with a TIFF file that retains a lot more detail for working on in post-production than the JPEG that had all the baked in colour profiles. Let's take a look at the two files that we've ended up with. On the left-hand side is the one created by DJI during flight, and it's the stitched together JPEG. Out of box, it looks like it's got more colour and contrast, but the one on the right is the one that we've created today and stitched together, and we can see that it's a flatter profile, which will make it easier to be able to process and get more information out of in the post-processing stage. But we can also see that by stitching it together ourselves, we've actually got a lot more retained information in the way that we've chosen to stitch it. So this will now give us a lot more latitude to go ahead and process up our images.
So that's how to create high quality, high resolution images that are stitched properly. And you don't need to use the DJI Mavic 4 Pro. You can use any of the drones in the series that support this functionality, and the work that you get should be equally good. My name's Nicholas Hill, and this has been another episode of Learn, Shoot, Repeat. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next episode.